Good morning, everyone. I'm Matt Scott with Beachcombing Magazine here in Aptos, California, and I'd like to welcome all of you to the Beachcombing Holiday Festival. For those of you who have just arrived in the Zoom room, here's some more info about today's festival. Okay, in the Zoom chat a while ago, I included the URL www.beachcombing.fun, where you can find info about today's activities. Definitely go there to visit and see all the vendors. You can also reach it through www.beachcombingmagazine.com. Some of you may have that bookmarked. Scroll down and check out the jewelry, crafts, beachcombing gear, advent calendars, travel tours, and a lot more. We've already been talking about some of that. And a lot of the vendors are offering discounts and show specials, so check that out. And a big thank you to those vendors and our Gold and Silver Beachcombing Club members who have made today's festival possible. As you've seen today, we have a presentation at 11 a.m. That's now, and then video premieres on YouTube at 12 p.m., 1 p.m., and 2 p.m. All times are Pacific. At the end of each session, there'll be time for Q&A on Zoom with our presenters and a bit of time for additional communication like some of you have already been doing. So now I have the honor of introducing our first presenter, Jason Sandy. He's an American architect and property developer who lives in London, England, and is an experienced mudlark on the River Thames. The correct term is mudlark, not mudlarker, by the way. Beachcombing magazine readers have read about the remarkable finds that Jason and other mudlarks have found from all eras of history: prehistoric, Roman, Middle Ages, Renaissance, Victorian, World War II era, and even today. Jason is the author of Thames Mudlarking, Searching for London's Lost Treasures, and his brand new book, which you can pre-order on Amazon, great gift idea, by the way, Mudlarks, Treasures from the Thames. I've actually had a chance to read the book before its release, and it is amazing. Besides stories about historical treasures, there are bios and photos of many other mudlarks. It's really a great read. Jason is an official member of the Exclusive Society of Thames Mudlarks, and he's a trustee of the Thames Museum Trust. Today, Jason will be discussing a once-in-a-lifetime chance that was given to Jason and friends who were asked by the Museum of London and Historical Royal Palaces to conduct an archaeological survey of the moat surrounding the ancient Tower of London Castle, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So during the presentation, feel free to type in questions in the chat. Kirsten and I will be keeping track of those. And after Jason's prezo, which is about 30 minutes, we'll then go through those questions. After the prezo, then you can unmute yourself and ask questions directly. So right now, everyone's muted but Jason, but just in case, make sure if you see yourself not muted, make sure you mute yourself. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mudlark Jason Sandy for his presentation, Medieval Moatlarking.
Thanks a lot, Matt, for the nice introduction. And thank you, Kirsty, for inviting me to speak today and share some of the history that we found there in the Tower of London. I hope everybody can hear me okay and see my screen. So as Matt said, today we're going to be talking about the medieval castle that's located in the central part of London. So it's actually along the River Thames, and you can see the ancient castle, which is located here. They started building it shortly after William the Conqueror invaded England. So in 1066 is when William the Conqueror came over from France. And he won at the Battle of Hastings and quickly moved throughout England. And he started building castles to defend his new nation, which he had established. So this began in 1078. So that's well over 1,000 years ago that this castle was started, the construction of the castle was started. And it's in a very idyllic location. This is the Victorian bridge called Tower Bridge, which is very iconic, and most of you know that from postcards and other images of London. So we're really in the heart of central London. And just to explain, the castle is located on the edge of the ancient Roman wall. So London used to be a walled city, and the Romans built that wall, and then it was made even higher during the medieval period. And the reason why they did that is because there were a lot of Viking attacks back in the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries. So before and even after William the Conqueror established a foothold here in England, we were plagued by Viking attacks, and the Vikings would sail up the River Thames and would pillage and destroy and pretty much take anything that they could in central London. So this was seen as a huge defensive fortress in order to protect the city on the edge of the wall um, in the Middle Ages. So as I mentioned, the construction work started in 1078. It started with this large tower called the White Tower, and that's because a lot of the stone was from um, the Kent area, so Kentish ragstone. And then over the next 1,000 years, the walls were developed into this fortress. And the tower was not only a defensive fortress and kind of defensive structure, but it also served many, many different functions, so many that I had to write them all down so I wouldn't forget. It was a royal palace as well. So Henry VIII and some of his wives stayed there, and some of them lost their heads there in the castle. It was a royal mint. So they used to mint a lot of the coins for all of Britain within the Tower of London. It was a prison and a dungeon. Most famously, the two princes were put and imprisoned in the tower. That was back in the 15th century, and they disappeared. And we know why, because their uncle, Richard III, wanted to become king. So those two princes were also in the castle. It was also a menagerie and a zoo for exotic animals, and I'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. It was a military barracks, obviously as a fortress. There were a lot of soldiers, even in the Middle Ages. Knights were living there, so it really was a fortress. There was also an arsenal and a munitions depot, as well as an armory unit where they were actually making cannonballs and making musket balls and other munitions within the castle. The castle is still home to one of the oldest medieval churches in England, and it's absolutely stunning. It dates back to the 12th, 13th centuries. And nowadays, it's even the home of the crown jewels. And many of you might have been to the Tower of London castle just to see the queen, or now the king's crown, the orb and the scepter, and the other crown jewels. So it's one of the most heavily guarded structures, even to this day in England. And that's why the royal jewels are located, the crown jewels are located within the castle. So originally, in the 13th century, they built the moat, which is kind of a quintessential feature for many medieval castles in Britain and also throughout Europe. So you can imagine it was very difficult to get across the moat and then scale the walls. So it was kind of a impregnable castle, and it really didn't have many battles that had to be fought from here. I was doing a lot of research, just trying to find how many battles were fought from this castle, and there's just only a handful, which I'll talk about a little bit later, and they're actually more recent. So for about 600 years, 500 to 600 years, the moat was located around the outside perimeter of the castle. But then in the 1840s, so right around beginning of the Victorian period, it was infilled because it was stagnant water. It just became so smelly that they decided to drain it and infill it with earth. So one of the most interesting things that was found back in 1997 was this very interesting fish, fish trap or eel trap. And it was made out of wicker, and it was hollow on the inside, and it had a series of arches in order to allow the fish to go in. And they would put food within inside it in order to lure the fish in. But because of this small hole, they could get in, but they couldn't get back out. So it's quite extraordinary that they were able to excavate this from the moat. So somebody must have forgotten to pull it up back in the Middle Ages, and it was left there. And they found over 177 bones, fragments of fish bones within the trap. And it was quite interesting because they found eel bones, chub, tench, another fish name that I can't say, flounder, and even flatfish were located within this. And it just shows what type of wildlife, what type of fish were actually swimming in the Thames back then. And also it just shows what people were actually eating back then, what type of fish they were eating and enjoyed also within the Tower of London Castle itself. One thing that mudlarks, and just going back to what Matt was saying earlier, a mudlark is somebody that scavenges the riverbed of the Thames at low tide. And I'm one of them. And we always go down at low tide looking for anything, lost treasures or anything that was lost over the past 2,000 years or even older of London's history. And this is one of the more interesting ones. It's actually a spearhead for spearing eels. And this was found outside of the Tower of London on the foreshore in front of the tower. And this area is strictly forbidden now, but back in the day, mudlarks were allowed to go looking for lost items in front of the Tower of London itself. But nowadays, in order to preserve that archaeology, that's strictly off limits, both to Society of Thames Mudlarks as well as normal permit holders. But within the Tower of London themselves, they have what's called a Cabinet of Curiosities, which is treasures from the Thames. And it shows a lot of the artifacts that mudlarks over the years have found in front of the Tower of London Castle, which are quite extraordinary, from medieval swords to daggers to even the spearhead, a halberd spearhead that dates back to the 15th century. They found archers' equipment and even little toys, little toy pistols that could actually fire small pellets. They found that in front of the castle. So as I mentioned, back in the 1840s is when they actually drained the moat and infilled it with dirt. And then it was used for various functions. So the Victorians used it as a grazing ground for cattle. So as you can imagine, in central London, there wasn't much open green space. So they would actually allow cattle and different livestock to live within the moat of the castle and graze on the grass that was growing within the castle walls or within the moat. This is a historic image from the First World War showing the soldiers actually using this as a training ground before they were shipped off to continental Europe to fight in the war. So because it was a fortress, there were a lot of soldiers that lived and worked within the castle making munitions, but they also used the moat as kind of extra space to do training ground, different assignments, and just train for the war itself. During the Second World War, as I mentioned, there was a lack of green space within central London. So they used the moat to grow fruit and vegetables in order to survive during the war. Because a lot of the supplies were not coming in from around the UK and around the world because of the Nazi bombing, they actually decided to use this moat in order to plant fruit and vegetables that could be eaten by the local people that lived around the castle and even by people living within the castle during the Second World War. So this year was the 70th anniversary of the Queen's coronation. And we had a huge festival. Many of you probably watched it on TV back in June, where we had a 2-day celebration where we had public holidays here in Britain. And to commemorate that momentous occasion, they decided at the Tower of London to convert the moat into a beautiful flower bed and it's kind of spectacular landscaped space. And it's called the Superbloom project. And it was designed by the Historic Royal Palaces, along with the landscape architects, Grant Associates, and the University of Sheffield professor of planting design called Nigel Dunnett. And they planted over 20 million seeds. These are all wildflowers. And they planted them within the moat. And then the irrigation system provided the water underground for them to grow. And I'll show you some pictures at the end of this presentation as to what it looked like when it was finished. But this was kind of the brief that was given to the builders. And the Historic Royal Palaces that run the Tower of London, they were not able to employ yeah, trained archaeologists to look at all of the moat as they were excavating. So the Historic Royal Palaces contacted the Museum of London and asked for their assistance or for volunteers in order to search within the moat itself for anything that could be found within the excavated dirt that they were digging up, which I'll show you in a second. So this view here, you can see Tower Bridge here in the background, and you see this wall with arches and then the castle on the right-hand side. This is the exact area in the First World War where these soldiers were actually camping out and using it as a training ground. So it's quite cool that we're literally searching exactly where all these soldiers had been practicing. And we found a lot of interesting artifacts within the moat that relate directly to those soldiers, which I'll come on to in a little bit. So within the moat itself, in order to water all the flowers, they were digging deep trenches. They were about, I would say, 2 to 3 feet deep within the ground in order to install the irrigation that would water the seedlings, so the 20 million seeds that they laid down. So within these trenches, I personally didn't think we would find that much, just because the moat had been infilled, and I thought it would just be 20th century or maybe even 19th century trash that people had thrown in from around the castle and also from around the surrounding walls. So there were 5 of us actually on the largest day looking for anything that we could find within the excavated soil. And on the left here, we have Tim Miller, who's the head of the Society of Thames Mudlarks. We have Nick Stevens, who's also a member. This is Stuart White, that's Museum of London. He works there as the Finds Liaison Officer and records everything that we found on that day. And then Alfred Hawkins, who was the curator and also the planner and organizer of this event. So he was the person that we were working for, and then myself here on the right-hand side. So we were very lucky to be the first people that have ever metal detected within the moat. So there's been a whole series of different excavations over the years, but they've always been in kind of sporadic areas. Nobody's actually gone through the whole moat and searched for lost artifacts. So back in the 1930s, there was a survey done. And most recently, between 1995 and 1999, there were several things that were found in the moat during excavations. Some of the most interesting things that people have found previously, which got us very excited, is they found 2 complete tankards, so like drinking mugs from a local pub. They found a complete flintlock pistol from the 18th century. They found a silver groat from Henry VI. That was again from medieval times. They found a Dutch penny from 1490 to 1550. So again, for over 500, 600 years old. Several complete leather shoes, a boat hook, pinner's bones, buckles, military buttons, mounts, cannonballs, lead shot, apothecary files, bone toothbrushes, and various glass and pottery vessels within the moat. So having read all of that, we were very excited to kind of get down there ourselves and start looking through the dirt to see if we could find anything. Fortunately, there were some trained archaeologists on site with us. And it was a great collaboration because a lot of times metal detectorists are a bit frowned upon by the trained archaeologists because they think we're just kind of messing around and just finding metallic things and not doing like a complete survey. But this was a great collaboration because they worked very closely with us. We found things that they wouldn't find because we were using metal detectors, and they found things that we wouldn't find because they were doing proper archaeological excavations with kind of a fine-toothed comb and really going layer by layer as they excavated down. So in this specific area, they dug a 3-meter deep trench. So that's roughly, I would say, between 9 and 10 feet they went down. And they did find some scraps of gold as they were digging down, which got us quite excited as well. So because they were digging down so deep, they were just pretty much making big piles of earth on both sides of that excavation they were doing. And then we came along and started searching those excavated piles of dirt to see if we could find anything metallic. And even by eye, we could find a lot of very interesting things just on the surface or as we combed through the dirt. So just to show you some of the most interesting things that we found, as you can imagine, we found a lot of broken bits of pottery. Some of it is very kind of stereotypical things that you do find even as a mudlark along the River Thames. The famous willow pattern, the blue transferware from Victorian times. This here in the center, the yellow bit is called Staffordshire comb slipware from between the 17th and 18th centuries. And here on the right-hand side, which is quite interesting, is spongeware from Scotland, which is quite interesting, showing that even some of the soldiers coming from Scotland brought some of their own kind of plates and other things, cups and saucers, and this was imported from Scotland and ended up in the moat itself. Other bits of colorful pottery that we found was Italian marbleized slipware from, again, the 17th century. We found parts of German stoneware from like the 16th and 17th centuries, Tudor green glaze and more Tudor green glaze from around the 16th century, and then tin glaze earthenware. So this is from Delft, and this is from circa the 17th century as well. So all of this kind of shows us what people were using in the surrounding area and also in the Tower of London. And as you can also imagine, people were constantly using the moat as kind of a dumping ground for anything that was broken or disused. So it's quite fascinating to discover these things and find out what people were using back centuries ago. This is one of the older things that we found, and this is a medieval floor tile from around the 13th, 14th centuries. And this was found by the Museum of London chap or friend of mine called Stuart. And again, this was just found on the surface that was just excavated by the diggers. I quite like this one. This was the spout from a teapot. It was no more. I kind of put it on the ground there to make it look interesting, but I thought it was quite interesting to see that the soldiers and other people were actually drinking tea, which is a very British thing. They were drinking that in the Tower of London moat as they were doing their drills and exercises. We also found a lot of clay pipes. This is one of the earlier ones from the 17th century. And then we found some nice decorated clay pipes from the Victorian time period. And this is quite interesting because it has kind of a wicker basket pattern on the perimeter outside of the clay pipe bowl. So you can imagine the soldiers smoking their clay pipes as they're going about their duties and then just chucking them into the moat afterwards. So within the first hour of us metal detecting, we hit this coin, and this was found by Nick Stevens. And this is a silver coin from Henry VIII. And we were really excited because we didn't expect to find anything that old, and especially so quickly. So this gave us a lot of hope for finding things that were much older. So this was found within the first hour of excavating. And then the next thing that I found personally was this medieval jeton, which is a reckoning counter. They use that to do complicated calculations, financial calculations on almost like a checkerboard system. And this is actually, you can see the fleur-de-lis on both sides within a shield. And the fleur-de-lis was kind of a symbol of France at that time period. And so this has been dated back to the 14th, 15th centuries. And this is a medieval jeton from France that was imported and shows that there was a lot of trading going on between the Tower of London and London itself and the French continent. So you can just imagine ships going back and forth, bringing goods into the Tower of London, and the Tower of London may be supplying weapons or armory or something to the French as well. So this is quite exciting. And the archaeologists got very excited because they hadn't found anything of this nature during their digs around the Tower of London before we arrived. So that was one of the most exciting first finds. And again, we found this within the first 2 hours of searching on the first day of the survey. Forgot to mention that the survey happened over 3 days, and they wanted us to come back every month. So we did one day each month for 3 months. And the reason why we did that is so that they could kind of dig out more things and spread the spoil out or the dirt out for us to detect it properly as we came through. So as I mentioned previously, there were a lot of soldiers that were based within the moat, and these are some of the bullets, so 303 rounds, so from Second World War that we found within the moat. Fortunately, these are just blanks. They weren't actually used or couldn't be fired themselves. They were just used for training purposes, but we did find quite a few bullets. This was one of the more interesting finds dating back to around the 14th, 15th centuries. And this predates an actual cannonball. This is a ballast or something that was used as a projectile, stone projectile that would be put into like a catapult system and thrown or slung at the enemy. So this is quite spectacular. And Stewart found this just kind of laying on top of some of the earth that had been excavated. And this was the earliest cannonball that we found. We found other fragments, but this is one of the earliest ballast or projectiles that we found dating back to the late medieval period. We also found a lot of things that are associated with military, such as badges, buttons, and other insignia. So this is a sleeve insignia, would have been worn on a soldier's uniform on their sleeve. And the shape of the crown is a king's crown. So we know that it's from either George V or George VI. So it kind of is between the First World War and Second World War. And again, it was probably a soldier training within the moat itself that this fell off as they were doing their drills within the moat. And according to the historic royal palaces, it was most likely worn by a third-class warrant officer. This was also quite interesting because the Tower of London doesn't have any official records of all the troops that were stationed at the castle, nor do they know who was actually doing all the training within the moat itself. So because we could find buttons that had insignia on them, so this says Lovat Scouts, and these were a group of Scottish Highland Yeomanry Regiment, part of that regiment, and they became the British Army's first sniper unit. And they were called the sharpshooters, and they served in both the First and Second World Wars. So this is the first Lovat Scout buttons that was ever found within the moat. And it was great because this just proves that these soldiers were active within the moat and did some of their training in there as well. This is another button that we found. You can see a crown, which is above a bugle, and you can see the English rose, which is in the center of the bugle. And the bugle was a symbol for the infantry. So again, it shows that other soldiers from the infantry were doing training or were stationed within the Tower Moat over the years. And this was my personal favorite find from a soldier. And this is from the Scots Guards, and it's one of their cap badges. So it would have been worn on the top of their hat. And unfortunately, it's quite encrusted. It's being restored at the moment so that you can see its beauty later. But the reason why I love it so much is it's one of the Scots Guards. And most of you know the Scots Guards, the guys with the bearskin hats on both sides, because you probably saw them during the Jubilee celebrations earlier this year. And even at the Queen's funeral, the Scots Guards were huge or played a big part in the actual procession, the funeral procession. And they stand outside the Tower of London to guard it, as well as Buckingham Palace. So they're very iconic. And most people, whenever they associate soldiers with England, you always think of the guys with the red coats and the bearskin hats, and they're called the Scots Guards. So it's quite fascinating to find a cap badge from one of the Scots Guards themselves. So as I mentioned, there weren't too many wars that were fought there at the Tower of London. But in World War II, the Tower of London took a direct hit from Nazi bombers. And unfortunately, one of the yeoman warders died in this attack. And you can see a huge part of the wall collapsed and fell into the moat itself. And on that exact spot, I found this interesting fragment, and it's an anti-aircraft fire shell. So this would be shot up in order to kind of knock out Nazi bombers. And you can see the word safe, and you can see the calibration lines and the numbers along here. So this is a fragment from a World War II shell that probably was shot maybe even from the Tower of London up into the air to try to knock out the airplanes flying past. And it's a great kind of poignant reminder of the soldiers that served within the tower and throughout London during the London Blitz back in World War II. This is quite interesting. It's a syphilis syringe from the 18th century. And if we have time later, I can tell you a little bit more of what that was used for. It's quite disgusting, but it was used to battle syphilis diseases back in the 18th century. We also found some jewelry. This is a little bit of a jewelry box, beautifully decorated. It looks almost Art Nouveau, so maybe early 20th century. That was also discovered by myself in the dirt there. This was found by Nick. It's a medieval book clasp. Again, probably from the 14th, 15th centuries. And again, I can talk about this afterwards if you have any queries about what a book clasp actually was used for. We also found some glass finds, and this is a stereotypical cod bottle, which had the famous marble inside. And I'm sure many of you have found cod marbles in the past, and this is from R. White. And this is a Victorian bottle that I found in the moat. And we also found a lot of bones, which just kind of shows you what animals were being eaten within the Tower of London. And then their bones were disposed of into the moat itself. So this is from a cow. So it shows that they were eating beef within the Tower of London. And this is quite interesting because this animal is extinct now in Britain, but it's a boar's tusk. And it just shows and proves that they were eating boar. You can just imagine like a boar on a spit within the Tower of London. And then again, they just chucked in the skeleton after they had finished eating it. And I found one of the boar's tusks. So I mentioned earlier that the Tower of London was used as a zoo. And back in the day, when a king or a queen had an official state visit, it was customary for them to bring a present for the British monarchy. And some of the African kings and queens would bring exotic African animals. And you can see the sculpture of the lions here in the foreground. And they found the skull of one of the lions within the moat during excavations back in, I believe it was the 1930s, or possibly within the 1990s when they did the other excavation. But it's quite fascinating. And they also found part of the original a lion tower where they used to keep the lions when it was a zoo. There were many other animals, like even African elephants, different monkeys, and even a polar bear that was kept within the Tower of London. And people could go visit the exotic animals that were kept. And these were, again, official presents from different people, different monarchs that would come and visit the kings and queens in England. So I'm not sure if you remember the story I told you last year when I gave a presentation about the polar bear, but the King of Norway came to Britain in 1252 AD. And as a present, he brought a polar bear, which he gave to Henry III. And it's quite interesting because the polar bear was so hungry, he became too expensive to feed. So they let him swim around in the Tower of London moat in order to catch his own fish, and also let him swim into the Thames. And they had like they call it a stout cord that they wrapped around his leg in order to make sure he didn't swim away. And they would just pull him back into the castle when he had finished feeding. But just imagine going to the Tower of London and watching a white polar bear swimming around in the moat, catching fish and finding his own dinner rather than paying to buy fish. They actually just let him go swim and find his own fish. Another thing that we found in the moat was buckles of different ages. This is from the 16th, 17th century. We found lead tokens, which were a type of currency back in the 17th and 18th centuries and even earlier, but this one dates to the post-medieval period. And Nick found this interesting French coin from the 15th century from Charles VII. And again, it just shows that there was a good link between France and England and trading and different merchants coming to London and leaving their coins or dropping their coins into the moat. As expected, we found a lot of Victorian coins. We found coins from, I believe this is Edward the 6th or 7th, probably 7th, from 1909, if you see here, so a silver sixpence. And at the end of the survey, at the end of each day, Stuart from the Museum of London would put all the things that we found into small bags and label them. And then he also kept a record of which part of the moat we found them in. And in total, we found over several hundred objects, and 200 of which they decided to keep. And they're going to be restored, and they're currently being recorded on the British Museum's website called the Portable Antiquities Scheme. And these are going to be preserved for future generations. And what they'd like to do is actually display them within the Tower of London, just to kind of show the wide breadth of things that we found within the tower, from coins to bones to even shrapnel from World War II, bullets from the soldiers, the buttons from the different regiments that were stationed there. So each one of these are small fragments, but when you put them together, it's almost like a puzzle. Each piece is a piece of the puzzle. And when you put them all together, you can really get a good picture of what was happening within the moat of the Tower of London. So they were very extremely happy that we actually helped them out, and we were all volunteers. We didn't get paid to do this, but it was for us a once in a lifetime opportunity to search for medieval artifacts within the Tower of London moat, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So it was definitely a dream to be there, and so interesting to discover the history of the moat within the tower. So these are some images that I just wanted to click through and show you now that the flower beds are finished. These are some of the images of the landscaped gardens within the Tower of London moat. And this was open this summer from June all the way up until September. And the flowers were blooming at different times. And it was just a very colorful memorial to Queen Elizabeth, commemorating not only her Jubilee, but unfortunately, as you know, she passed away in September. And so people went here to remember all the things that she did during her 70-year reign. So it's just a very poignant tribute to one of the longest reigning monarchs in British history. So I just wanted to end briefly with my new book that actually comes out this week on December 8th. If you're looking for a nice Christmas present for people that like searching for lost treasures, beachcombing, mudlarking, anything of that nature, this is the book for you. I kind of go through different categories of finds, from belt buckles to shoe buckles, coins, bottles that we find. And another part of the book is not only telling the stories about the artifacts that we find in the River Thames, but also letting the different mudlarks share their own personal stories. So I've showcased 33 different mudlarks within the book from all different ages. So mothers and daughters that mudlark, to young children that mudlark, to even some veteran mudlarks that this is Graham, who's 86 years old, and he's still mudlarking along the River Thames. So they share their kind of heartwarming personal stories, as well as showcasing many of the different artifacts that we found within or along the River Thames. And special thanks to Kirsty for putting the book together. It's been really a labor of love over the past many months. And I'm just forever grateful for everything that she's done to put the book together. And I hope that you guys really like it. It's very large. It's 300 pages long, and it's got over 500 color illustrations of the artifacts and the people that find the different lost objects along the River Thames. So thanks again for having me. I hope you learned something about the Tower of London and enjoyed seeing some of the things that we discovered within the moat of the medieval castle. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. That was great. What a fun presentation. What a great opportunity. I had no idea that Moat even existed. You just sort of gloss over it, but wow, that was very cool. We had a ton of questions.
Great.
A lot of people asking. So Matt, I don't know if you want to jump in.
Yeah, tons and tons of questions. So apologies if we don't get to your question. So I'll start going through the ones maybe more related to what you talked about today, Jason. So
Sure.
first question is, how do you date these items? When you find something and you say, oh, it's from, the 1700s or 1500s, how do you go about doing that?
So fortunately, we had the Museum of London there with us at all times. And we also had trained archaeologists there with us. So if we weren't able to identify it ourselves, then we had them in order to identify it for us. So for instance, what was it? The Scots Guards badge that I found, because it was so heavily corroded, I thought it was just a piece of scrap metal. And fortunately, I handed it in to the museum, showed them, and then they were able to give it a quick wash, and did a bit of a search online as well. And they discovered by the end of the day that it was from the Scots Guards. So I was just so happy that they were there in order to identify a lot of the things for us.
Got you. And then once they're found, and you showed a lot of them and talked about the cleaning process, how do they clean them without damaging them?
So they haven't really told us exactly how they're going to clean them. But as a mudlark, we do have learned over the years. I've been mudlarking and cleaning a lot of my artifacts for the past 10 years. I tend to use electrolysis, which is a gentle kind of using electricity to fizz the metallic objects, and that gently releases all of the incrustation, and then you can fully see the design on it. So there's YouTube videos if you're interested to learn about how to use electrolysis, but I find that's the most effective way. I'm sure trained archaeologists have other more scientific methods, but that's what works for me personally.
When you're using the metal detectors, this is part of my question someone else asked, how far are you searching and digging? Like, how far down do the metal detectors find something?
So that's a really good question, because we weren't allowed to actually dig any further into the moat. We're only allowed to search what they had excavated. So whatever they dug up, we were allowed to search. And we actually asked them to use the plow and their digger in order to kind of move things around for us. So it was a little bit easier. So we were only detecting about maybe I would say a foot to 2 feet deep in some locations. And then sometimes I would disperse it. I got my shovel out, would disperse it just to be a little bit flatter, so you don't have too many signals, and it was a little bit easier to search.
Gotcha. Couple of questions about what some of these items are made of. Like, what are the pipes made of? What are the buttons are made of?
So the buttons are all pretty much made out of brass, and brass was a very durable material. It doesn't rust. It's not like iron, which rusts when it comes into contact with water or air. Brass is a very stable material. So most of the buttons are all made of brass, and all of the cap badges and things of that nature were also made of brass. And also when you buff those, so originally they were highly polished and had a very beautiful appearance. And over time, it's just kind of dulled down because it's been in the earth for many decades or even centuries. The clay pipes, as the name says, it's made of a fine white clay. So it looks like some people mistake it for being bone, but it's actually a very fine white clay that comes from Cornwall. And there were over 1,000 pipe makers in London back in the 17th and 18th centuries. And everybody used to smoke. They used to think it was medicinal. So if you weren't feeling well, the doctor would recommend a smoke. Or during the plague, In 1665, doctors were recommending that you smoke in order to clear your lungs of the plague, which seems perverse now, but that was the official guidance they were giving people back then. So everybody smoked, and that's why we find so many clay pipes in the moat and also along the River Thames.
You noted that they kept track of everything and then kept some things. Were you guys able to keep anything yourselves?
No, so it was an official survey. So we had to hand in everything that we found, which is definitely what we wanted to do anyways. And as I mentioned, each piece, whether it was a broken fragment or something complete, it was a piece of the puzzle that they're kind of stitching back together to tell the whole story of the moat. So, like I said, we were the first metal detectorists to go into the moat, and that's where we found a lot of metal that archaeologists hadn't found previously. So it was kind of a win-win situation. We have trained archaeologists and metal detectorists finding everything that each other hadn't found before. So, but we weren't allowed to keep anything.
But when you're doing regular mudlarking, you are able to keep some things, correct?
Yeah, so as a mudlark, anything as part of my license, anything that's 300 years or older, or that could be of some kind of historical significance, you have to report to the Museum of London on a regular basis. So we report those artifacts, but most of the time we're allowed to keep everything that we find. But it's the ultimate thrill to kind of donate something to the museum and have it displayed within the museum itself.
Since there were so many soldiers and weapons and bullets and ordnances, was there any fear that you might find a live bomb? Was there anyone on site to identify that?
That's always a problem because London was so heavily bombed during World War II, especially even along the River Thames. I have a whole chapter about all the weapons that we found along the River Thames, including unexploded bombs. Fortunately, we only found unfired bullets within the Tower of London moat. But yeah, that was a risk that we could have found a live grenade or other ordnances.
Okay. I'm gonna ask about two more questions, then open it up. And we do have kind of a hard stop. Kirsty says at about 11:55. So we've got about 8 or 9 more minutes. This might sound a little creepy. Did you ever find any human remains this time?
Fortunately, we didn't.
Okay.
But we're not bone experts ourselves. So we did find quite a few bones, but we don't think any of them were human. We think they were all just animal bones.
Did you find any like kind of precious metal, like gold items or anything like that?
So we found a lot of silver. So silver hammered coins are not common, but relatively common on the River Thames. We did find a few of them within the moat, but the mudlarks, nobody found anything gold. As I mentioned, the archaeologists found a couple of scraps of gold, but they were kind of clippings rather than actual jewelry or anything else.
Hey, everyone, if anyone wants to unmute themselves and ask a direct question, I've tried to go through a lot of the questions. I know I didn't get to all of them, but if there's any question that's come up that you really want to ask Jason, we have about 5 or 6 more minutes.
A couple people did want to know about the syphilis syringe.
Okay, it's pretty disgusting. So you might want to leave now if you don't want to hear this story. But so just actually in this image that's on the screen now, so that's Tower Bridge. And just behind the bridge on the left-hand side is an area called Wapping. And there were a lot of sailors that used to live in the Wapping area. And they would be stationed there for several months. And it was notorious for its brothels and prostitution within that area. And in order to combat venereal diseases like syphilis, men would inject mercury in their privates using that syringe. So they would actually put mercury within the syringe and inject it into their man parts. But a lot of them died because of the mercury, not because of the venereal disease, but because the mercury is poisonous, and having it injected into your man parts just made them more sick than what they were sick with just venereal diseases. So we think probably one of the sailors chucked it into the moat at some point and got rid of his syringe, but it's just, yeah, pretty disgusting.
Anybody else have any questions? Now that we've solved the syringe.
Probably too much information.
But yeah, Jason, this was really, really fascinating. I think people did have a bunch of questions in the chat. So if you look it over later, if you feel like answering any of those, that would be great. Just a lot of questions about what you can keep, how, what happens to the things that people find and who can go. So, but what a great presentation. Really appreciate it. It was awesome.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Did you ever meet the Queen? That's the last question.
I saw her in person, but I never got to shake her hand.
Okay. So you guys, thank you so much to Jason. You can always find him online at Jason Mudlark, and he posts fascinating finds, and you could message him there with any of your other questions. Be sure to order his book. It's on Amazon and all fine online retailers.
Barnes and Nobles has it, Target has it. Yeah.
Okay, not so fine retailers too. Just kidding. But it's really fun. It's a great book. So I can say I haven't seen the whole thing many, many times. But so after this, just so you know, at 12 o'clock, make sure that you head over to YouTube. I just put the link in the chat, but you can find all the links at www.beachcombing.fun. And we're going to watch a video of Captain Kai taking us on underwater beachcombing trip, and it's pretty fun. He finds some amazing stuff, and it's just fun. We get to a little peek into his life living on a sailboat. And then afterwards he'll be on the same Zoom, and you guys can leave the Zoom, come back. We'll be here all day, and he'll be there to answer your questions. And also we have a giveaway of some of his sea glass. So that was great. But Jason, thank you so much. I hope you can stick around, but I understand it's a little late there.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Bye, Jason. Thank you.